Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Mark Bennett. Mark is the director of Portal, which is Trinity College Dublin's new innovation hub. Mark holds a BA in environmental science from Trinity College and a master's in international management from King's College London, and a postgrad in sustainable energy finance from Dublin City University. Mark has previously been the country manager for an international co-working and innovation school scale-up, and he was the founder of Internet of Things mobility startup and led sustainability projects for Dublin City Council. He's worked in both the public and private sectors and for NGOs on environmental and business strategy in Ireland, the US, UK, Italy, and many other places. Mark's a real advocate for the power of technology to create competitive advantage for a more sustainable future, and we're here to learn more about that today. So welcome, Mark. How are you doing?
Good to be here, Dan. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, it's been a while since, well, so it was in Dublin last year. That was tons of fun to see you there. But we first met in Zurich, right?
That's right. What feels like moons and moons ago, but like in the scheme of things, probably not that long, but lots of has happened in between.
Yeah.
And you know that those experiences, including in Switzerland, are the reason that I've stayed in the entrepreneurial and innovation space, because it's just so super exciting. You can get a lot done, you can have impact, but you meet people like yourself, really interesting, engaging, ambitious people, and that's hard to switch off.
Yeah, indeed. So that was about, I mean, I'm also going to date myself. That was 2017 or so, right?
Yeah.
Did that happen? And so since then, you know, you were running a startup at that time. And since then, you moved back to Ireland. And tell us a little bit about what you've been doing since 2017 that got you into what you're doing now. And also, please tell us about what you're doing now.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I met you, Dan, in Switzerland, I was working on a low power wide area technology, a radio technology that would allow cities to see where bicycles are, but would allow owners to understand where their bikes are and crucially whether they're being stolen. And going to Switzerland gave me the opportunity to work with AXA Insurance and Swisscom to do a proof of concept, and ran that successfully. I think what I learned was, don't be a hostage to fortune when it comes to technology. You know, novelty and innovation, you know, it needs to be moderation in different contexts. And when you're just starting out, going high technology and high novelty is a bit difficult. So when I came back to Ireland, I realized that this LoRa, low power wide area network, was not going to be rolled out as quickly as anybody thought. And though I just raised some more VC money, I decided not to sign the term sheet and wind it down. And in fact, it was in those death throes of that startup that I met Talent Garden, who are this Italian startup, super interesting leadership team, really ambitious. They'd raised about 12 million euro as a co-working and innovation school to come to Dublin. And we hit it off, and they invited me to join the leadership team and be country manager for the Irish operation. We were probably about 140 employees at that point. And when I left about 2.5 years later, we were at 170 and growing. And this was also during the pandemic. So, you know, I got to experience what it's like running a co-working and innovation school when everything shuts down, kind of whites of the eyes moment.
And was that, those 170 all based in Dublin?
No, so they were, so at that stage, during my time with Talent Garden, another 43 million euro was raised for further expansion throughout Europe. So it went, I think at the point that I left, there were 22 campuses across Europe. So in Spain, in Copenhagen, in Austria. And so at that point, we were 170 employees. But there would have been thousands members essentially. So the main thrust for Talent Garden and what worked very, very well initially for them was the idea of digital transformation, because as we know, that's a project still to be done. At the same time as we have to save the world in the climate crisis, there is also the promise of digitization to make things more efficient and make people's lives better.
Right.
And that's an ongoing work. And so Talent Garden created kind of a speciality in that. And something that I learned there actually is something that I'm bringing to this Trinity experience, is that, you know, innovation, research, you know, what works in a market is like those physics 3-body problems, you know, where each of the objects start out, but once they start interacting with each other, you can't work out where it ends up. They're totally emergent properties. And that if you over prescribe, which is something that, you know, public sector organizations often do because of the way that they're set up bureaucratically, that can actually damage the proposition. So it's that delicate balance between, you know, having something that's dynamic, but also manageable as well.
Sure, sure. And so just to set some context for the listeners, how is Talent Garden as a co-working space or co-working initiative different than, you know, say, WeWork or others? You know, I'll use the obvious,
well, I think, you know,
obvious comparison. Right?
You know, the ecosystem where everybody says, well, it's Uber for this or it's the Stripe
Yeah.
for that. So that's where people go to first, and I totally understand it. It's because that's the co-working that people know, and also co-working that many people love, and there's great companies have been, you know, created in those spaces. But I think what people like Talent Garden and this Innovation Hub in Trinity would say is that they really go after, they target the market differently. And so what you're trying to create is like a gravity around certain domains. So when I worked in Talent Garden in Dublin, we looked at computer vision and AI around computer vision, and what happens if you take, you know, some of the expertise from Intel and some of the programmers from the city and some of the people working in garages on IoT equipment, and you put them all together in the same space. What kind of robotics outcomes do you get? What kind of, you know, space management outcomes do you get? And one of the things that Talent Garden was very good at as well, and I learned a lot from the very fresh approach that they took as a leadership team, was to always experiment with things. So in fact, we experimented with our own building. So we would have done a LiDAR, kind of a radar scan of the building, so that when we had this accelerator working with Intel, we were able to use our own building as a use case. So you could have drones flying around and not hitting into pillars, because we had made that contribution to the mix.
Interesting. And so now you're building this center. So when I was there last year, I think you were in planning stages. You're still in planning stages, and maybe near breaking ground stages. So how is it that, you know, the Trinity College Dublin and the city got involved in doing this? So it's a you know, for those that know Dublin, you know, they've got this area near the river, right? And then around there are also like several big corporate buildings that are many of the big, you know, tech names that we all know about and hear about. But it's kind of right in that area, and it's a pretty big space. And so how is it that this was determined to do that project, and how'd you get involved?
Yeah, I suppose just as you're describing it, it kind of reminds me of the idea of fractals. So, you know, what happened in Dublin is a little bit like what happens with globalization, really anywhere at kind of a macro scale, which is that when that site was a 5.2 acre site, which now is in the center of things, you know, but that site originally would have been in the Docklands area, pre-development of the Docklands area. And it, as an enterprise campus, not anything to do with Trinity, but as an enterprise campus set up by the Industrial Development Agency, which we now call the IDA in Ireland. Fantastic, one of the world's most effective inward investment agencies. And they had set it up in that location to essentially to look at craft and to look at some microelectronics, very physical world. So not digital at all, but rather small enterprise spaces for the physical world, let's say. And as we know, since 1987, Ireland had a very strong push towards service economy. We brought in a lot of manufacturing, technology manufacturing. So we would have had Gateway, we would have had Dell computers come in. A lot of the pharma companies came in at that point. A very high value, low volume technology and engineering. And over time, of course, as we developed the Docklands, that area became less important for that, you know, industrial development policy, because in fact they were becoming surrounded by the tech firms, the banks, the law firms, and all the ancillary services that go along with that, and not just for the Irish market, in fact mainly for the international market. And that was driven by many things, you know, young, highly educated workforce, multilingual, but also, as we know, some of the tax benefits that were created in Ireland, you know.
Exactly.
You know,
And so those low-rise buildings were more for those like pharma and industrial things, and then the high-rises came later, I suspect, you know.
exactly. And so that site didn't develop along with those, because that site was, let's call it the public interest, and there was something quite unique about it and had some unique features. So for example, some heritage buildings on it. So the decision was made, in fact, for Trinity to take over that site.
Okay.
Trinity rechristened it the Trinity Technology and Enterprise Centre, and didn't change too much, but just started to change the complexion of who was in there. So we started to have some digital services companies go in there, some business development companies, energy efficiency, and also Trinity started to put researchers down there doing primary research. So the Advanced Microscopy Lab, for example. Okay. And as a quick sidebar, that location was perfect because that's all reclaimed land from the sea. So it's all muddy. Yeah. And the great thing is that the vibrations of the city get absorbed by the mud and the silt. So it's a great place to do microscope work where you're just doing scanning electron microscopes and you can't have any vibration. Right. But having that as the, you know, as the substrate. Whereas if you tried to do that microscopy in the main campus, which is a 10-minute walk away, you wouldn't be able to do it because of all the vibrations. So it has unique characteristics. But it is 5.2 acres in some of the most prime real estate of the city. And so Trinity had a plan to, you know, make it a profile addition to the, you know, portfolio of Trinity College, which for anybody who's ever been to Dublin, Trinity is essentially the geographical almost center of the city. And now some of the centers of gravity around some of those domains, let's say digital, legal, banking, have gone down towards the Docklands area. And so Trinity now finds itself at the center again in a different way. And so what kind of facilities do we put down there that are relevant really to the next wave? Because if we're harmonizing our tax as the rest of Europe and indeed the OECD at 15%, then we need to be known for the other things that we excel at, such as the, you know, the way that we treat IP, R&D, the, you know, living standards that our workers have, and the innovation that we manage to produce. And so Trinity wants to be that innovation engine at the center of that location. And that's the logic for putting in Portal and the other things that we'll do on that campus. Okay, that sounds awesome. I mean, I was there, I took a look around. It looks like, you know, the kind of place where you can make something really cool. It's got all the right surroundings. As you said, some of the buildings are a little bit kind of older and hit, like, you know, how do you go say it? Say it. It can be hip, right? Like if you, I think it's going to be hip. And, you know, I think there's something to, so the concept for this has been evolving actually over the last 20 years since Trinity has owned it, because, you know, we have different provosts or presidents of the university. And so the previous president had an idea to create something that was really in the manner of what exists around it. So kind of high rise, which is fine, you know, but the new provost has what I think in the end might be a more interesting idea and more of its time, which is to say there's a lot of embodied carbon in the existing infrastructure. And perhaps we can use this site as an exemplar for how every city in the world is going to have to develop into the future, and to keep the carbon that's locked in there and build on top of it. So for example, the way that these buildings have been built, they have incredibly strong foundations. So in fact, we can go up with timber structures. We can put on green walls. We can start to think about, you know, the materiality of the impact, because it's only 5.2 acres, will be limited necessarily, but the impact in terms of the ability to do proofs of concept, to be a location that people can come and look at how it can be done in the future, I think is, you know, is exceptional. In the same way as when we were putting in €1 billion campus, we were talking about that we're close to the airport, that we're, you know, within the city center of the capital city of the country. And so we can, you know, influence our peers across the country as well. And the great work that they're doing, we can replicate here. Right. Yeah. Right. And so what kind of residents do you anticipate to have there? So are you involved in kind of crafting the program as well as the branding of it, or is it just about getting it built at this point? Well, there's different layers. So we already have in place a program manager, Emma, my colleague, who's looking at that programming side of it. But the Portal project is 5,500 square meter let's call it 60,000 square foot facility that had maybe 330 desks in it. So it's quite, and a public cafe, 100-seater event space, 20-seater boardroom. You know, maybe it's running, building population might be on a good day 500 people, but the camp
and open to the students, or is it you know, private enterprise that will rent it, or private public consortiums? Like how does it relate to the academia part of it? And the
yeah, so I mean, the talent pipeline coming from the university is of course a huge sell. Anybody who wants to take space. So there's no doubt that it'll be, you know, a popular space for people to rent out. But of course, Trinity is doing this not only for the interests of the ecosystem, but also the interest of its own researchers and spin-outs, and a place to, you know, hold and get the most value possible from the intellectual property that it's had a hand in creating. So if you look at the moment, Trinity is one of the most entrepreneurial and one of the most successful in terms of spin-outs, but yet doesn't have an enterprise space to hold them. And because we're city center campus, heritage campus, there's very little to do, like there's not much room to expand in the very city center, but we do have this facility. So one of the areas that it's actually multiple areas, and I think it speaks to this inter and multidisciplinarity approach that we need to have when we're tackling these big societal problems like climate change, biodiversity loss, etc., is we've got a new approach, which is the E3, so engineering, environment, and emerging technologies, and co-locating them. And we have one element, which is what we're calling a learning foundry. So that'll be the education side of it. And then there'll be a research institute element of it as well. And whereas we were going to put in a big hundreds of millions of euro worth of facility to house that, actually now we're going to take a different approach, and you probably bring it down to the same campus, but just do it in a different way. So there's quite a lot of excitement actually, because I think it excites a lot more people, and it's something that's a little bit more human scale, I think.
Sure.
But emerging still. And so whereas let's say in Portal, Emma, my colleague, and myself have a lot of domain over the way that we envisage it working, the mix, because it will always be a mix of freelancers, the people who kind of service the other companies in the building,
right?
Then the researchers who come in because they want to be close to startups from the ecosystem, the researchers who then decide, my goodness, I could do that myself, I could commercialize this research. And then, you know, the corporates as well who want to play the game with us, because as you were saying, you know, we're surrounded by some of the top technology firms in the world, and Trinity is a leading university of the world, and finding ways to make those institutions work together in, you know, it's not a safe space, but in a space where, you know, we also understand how licensing works and how IP assignment works and how to play this game professionally. So Trinity has Trinity Research and Innovation, which is, you know, a whole collection of people who understand the legislation. Like we have a technology transfer office. We have an office that can broker research between, you know, enterprise and researchers. So,
and does Trinity have a ethos or tradition of commercializing that sort of thing? I mean, some universities, either they try to take some piece of equity of things that are developed in the university, or I think what's a better model is they use their facilities as a means of just cash flow, right? Because finding innovation facilities in different industries, particularly depending upon the equipment you need, is difficult for corporates, and they'll usually pay a pretty high premium to get access to things like that, and, you know, potentially services, right?
Well, I'd say we do both. So Trinity is a wonderful research institution that recognizes the value of fundamental research, and that's great. And that's in some ways its core and where it's come from. But obviously, you know, the global situations such as they are, there are big societal problems, whether they're in the engineering sphere or in the health sphere, in public policy, you know, and those are things obviously that people want to work on. And there is funding available. So we have a research development office who looks and scans at the European funding or the other funding globally to work on problems. And so that's the approach that's taken. In terms of, you know, if something is licensable and if it is to be spun out, we also have those sorts, and there's an office which will take care of, you know, negotiating what's Trinity's interest in that company going forward. But I'd say it's not an extraction model. It's definitely a support model. And I think it's evolving as well. When we have this enterprise space, obviously the model will evolve, and how we transact value, whether it's cash or whether it's access to the technology or other value. I think that'll all again emerge from when we run the space.
Okay, sounds great. Looking forward to that. And so what about the wider Irish ecosystem? Is I think that in the international press, there's discussion, of course, about the tax haven status and what's going to happen there. And when you walk around the place, you really gain a sense for the scale of the footprint that many of these large tech companies have. I mean, similar thing has happened here in Zurich. I'm not sure when the last time you were here, but certainly since 2017, Google's built out a huge infrastructure, and many people, I hear a lot more English, not like American English being spoken on the street and things like this. So I think that, I mean, I'm kind of head down in my own business, but I have the impression that as these big corporates come in, people stay, they find a partner and they get married and they have kids, and they kind of like migrate then to the place where they came originally for potentially a job. And those skills that, obviously they need to work at those companies are transferable to doing different entrepreneurially related things, which starts to replicate more, I think, the ecosystem that you have like in Silicon Valley, right? Like where you have a lot of big tech companies that sort of just like jettison talent, right? And you do have universities there. I mean, everyone talks about Stanford, but it's actually a pretty small university at the end of the day, right? But you have just a lot of talent that's coming out of these companies. I don't know if there's other cities where we've seen that as much, because they're bigger cities, like Berlin and London are bigger cities. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that, like how you see the ecosystem changing. Maybe it's going to change to the negative because these companies will exit because they don't have the tax revenue or the tax break. But
yeah, I mean, this is something that exercises politicians, public policy people, citizens in Ireland all the time, because it really has had a material impact on house prices, on services. It's great in terms of tax intake, but there's also, you need to have a basket of opportunities into the future, and you have to remember to support your smaller companies. And of course, it's the classic thing as well, like when companies start to develop, they get to a certain size and they might be bought by some of the bigger companies. And so, do we have as many unicorns as we might have had if we didn't have the big companies here so close, looking at those technologies and then buying them? So, but you don't want to, worry the golden goose too much, because it's working out quite well. And so,
and has that happened? I mean, has that happened that you've had locally based multinationals buying up technologies that happened to be just down the street? Like,
I think it's more that, we've had certainly people have been invested in, let's say. So a lot of the big companies would have venture arms, right, and they'd source, money coming in. I think it'd be unfair to say, that they've in any way hampered innovation. I just think that the innovation happens in a different place, maybe with a different brand. And there's nothing to say that some of those innovations mightn't spin back out again. And in fact, that is totally healthy. And I think that's what we in Portal would look to encourage, is that, if we look at startups, not all startups are destined to succeed. And therefore, what you want is you're kind of creating a context in which you have talent that goes into a startup, maybe comes back out because it didn't work, goes into the academic world, might even come back out and go and work in the corporate world. And we do have academics in Trinity, for example, who would have set up companies, gone and worked for Google, come back to research. And that's fantastic, because you have people understanding the different worlds and motivations. And as a peer group, people starting out, that rich experience, it's very hard to, it's very hard to find a course to be able to replicate that. So I think it really adds to the proposition of a university if they have a space that they can do that. I think, I would say this, wouldn't I? But really, there are so many things going for Ireland when it comes to attracting multinationals. Our population is growing. It is a very young population. It's become exceedingly cosmopolitan in a very good way. The city itself has, we've gone through the financial crisis, and the city came out of it really, we went through a very dark time where we had the IMF coming in, but
Mhm.
actually Ireland has bounced back probably better than all of the other, smaller economies.
Yeah.
And we're heading into uncertain times, but we've just had a budget where there was people were somehow calling it a giveaway budget because there was so much money coming in as corporate tax receipts.
Right.
And I don't see, there isn't anything immediately apparent that would change that.
Okay.
There's always problems. As I said, you have house prices have gone up, but we can see that that's really happening everywhere at the moment. So
you have to build more houses, more housing stock. I mean, also here in
it would
Zurich,
only be so easy.
yeah, here in Zurich, the building is just like off the hook, and the transportation infrastructure maybe can't handle it. But
it's one of those things, if only saying it made it so.
Yeah. I mean, my impression is that, if you attract companies that are going to employ several thousand people, each of those people has, maybe, I don't know what the number is, maybe 1.7 on average, other people attached to them, family, partners and kids. So yeah, it causes cities to grow. I think it's great. I think it's great to see more urban ecosystems around Europe and around the world kind of like making their way into this. I think my sense is the investment community hasn't really followed suit, right? I don't know, maybe we can make some comments about that. Into this kind of multinationalization of the talent pool, right? So like with people being able to work online more, and then also I think younger people wanting to do things that are more entrepreneurially related because it's in the media, it's on LinkedIn, it's on Facebook, it's in places like that. And so also we see this in our company. You see more young people coming out. They're not looking for a job at a big company anymore. They're looking for interesting work they can do at a growing company. And, they're kind of clued into that being a path. But still, I think that the availability of the support infrastructure for the startup ecosystem and the innovation ecosystem outside of some of the big cities is just not where it needs to be, right? So like I don't do a lot of traveling, but I think if think about places like Silicon Valley or Israel or a bit London, sometimes in some cases Berlin, but still like the availability of kind of support infrastructure and capital in those places is nothing like what it is in Silicon Valley or maybe even New York, right? And I hope that's going to change. I hope that you're going to see investors crossing borders more and saying, well, it doesn't really matter where the company is based, because it could be that the workforce is based everywhere. And it could be that the addressable market is almost everywhere. Whereas just 5 or 10 years ago, many companies started super locally, usually in the United States, because it was a big market and they could deal with it one-to-one. But now if people are not even going to the office anymore, what's the world gonna turn into in many
and we've had companies like Hopin, born on the internet, but truly born on the internet, servicing an internet community with an internet product with people based all around the world. No HQ, you open the laptop, that's the company. Which is really remarkable.
I think that's going to be much more the model of the future. I think it's exciting for young people that they're going to have that flexibility of moving around, particularly if you have more mechanization in manufacturing and even mechanization in research. Like my wife does research in the food industry. And in a lot of cases, when they run these tests, they have to go set them up and then they can leave and come back 5 days later. And the machine monitors everything that's going on. Right?
Trinity is also interested in that as well. We have some of the most expensive real estate in the city, and in this city, that means the world. And maybe there are other locations where that type of mechanized, that it doesn't really require the human intervention. Could that be done?
Exactly. It could be done remotely. It can be done remotely by someone else. It could be done remotely by someone who travels there infrequently. The fact of the matter is, I think that people who have a lot to contribute intellectually, will want to live in urban centers because they enjoy it, right? Others may want to live in outdoor centers because they enjoy that. And so I still think that part of the value proposition of any employer is not just money and professional opportunity, but it's also lifestyle. And I think Dublin has this advantage. I think Zurich has this advantage.
And I think there's the why, why are we doing things? People are working a lot more to purpose now as well, and they're respecting their own time. And, so these higher value propositions really speak to people, you know, and I think that's why there's a great, you know, talent pool latent there for working on these societal problems, you know. So I think Trinity is pulling on a very rich seam, I think, or rich thread going down this road. In terms of, you know, the supports for the ecosystem, I think we're really quite lucky because we have something called Enterprise Ireland, which deploys a lot of money into the ecosystem. And you made a very good point, actually, when you said, you know, outside of the main cities, because I think that's a little bit of a trap that people can fall into, is just concentrating on the main cities, whereas you know, we have a number of other cities on the island, but also the innovation isn't restricted to the big universities or the big cities. It's actually spread around. And how do you make sure that you're capturing it? It would be crazy not to. And so Enterprise Ireland has local enterprise offices literally all across the country. And Irish people are quite heavily networked and networking kind of people. Yeah. So very quickly,
we noticed.
Yeah, there's very, you know, there's not many degrees of separation between people, and that can work in a really good way. And Enterprise Ireland has a lot of, we have the high potential startup unit within Enterprise Ireland, which will, you know, really pick winners and back them and introduce them using a network all across the world, actually, of offices in New York or Beijing, etc.
Oh, that's super interesting. I mean, Switzerland has a model like this, which we've taken advantage of too, which I think is just fantastic. There's a couple of different organizations. One is like just federal money that can basically fund research at universities for the benefit of startups. It's like a collaboration. And then they have a coaching program. And then they also have a kind of it's a private enterprise, but it's, I think, funded by the government, that they partner with the embassies around the world. And so I'm going to Korea, for example, in 2 weeks, and like, you know, I can go to the embassy and meet there, and then they know businesses and know companies, and it's just like a way to get to know what's going on. I think these small economies, which both Switzerland and Ireland are small economies, they have to do this. They have to be outward focused, and they have to be there to support their businesses to internationalize, which I think is awesome. And
I think it's amazing. As I said, we have one of the best inward investment organizations in the world that really punches above its weight. And then we have this great, you know, because of course, if you're, as you said, small economies, you know, the market isn't going to be an internal market above a certain scale. It's going to be international. So it's just incredible for a company who's starting up to be able to go and work from an office in New York. Now, of course, we work in, you know, serviced offices, but you can imagine 20, 30 years ago, this was just an incredible way for Irish companies to just get a foothold in other markets. And then, you know, once they stabilize, then they go out and find their own space.
Right. Well, it's also just knowledge. I mean, every little bit helps, right? Like if you get a little bit of a leg up, find a lawyer, find this person there, find that person there. It's not a silver bullet, but I just think the fact that the government realizes that this is part of the requirement for maintaining like high GDP per capita ratio, that's really smart. And I think in some ways, some of these smaller economies, let's add another one to that, Israel, I think that they might overtake some of the bigger, more mechanized economies of the last 100 years, which would be US, UK, Germany, just because of the way that they're, you know, completely focused on like, yeah, we're going to basically innovate and do everything out, you know, external, and focus on high value added technologies. And so it's much more of a threat to them if they fall behind, because they really have nothing else to fall back on. And so they're probably pivoting faster towards that than some of the bigger economies like my own country, like America. Right now.
And we do, like, it's a gift for Ireland to do things like software as a service, you know, infinitely scalable. And, you know, then some of those limits to growth that might have been there around how many developers or engineers you can get on board. But of course, now that, you know, the world has changed and there's a lot of people working across borders, and you can solve some of those constraints to growth.
And what's the percentage of that population, you know, Trinity College, and then also the people that'll take advantage of your center, of Portal, that are Irish nationals versus immigrant nationals? And like, what's the status of the immigration kind of population?
Well, Trinity would be one of the most international of the universities, and we have a huge international population coming in, non-EU. Which of course, you know, for the university, that's an incredibly rich resource to draw on. In terms of like the ecosystem, as we were saying, we have a lot of people, you know, who've been attracted to the city by the big tech firms, law firms, financial firms, and they might work there for a while and they might want to take a break and step out and do something entrepreneurial. And so we get the benefit of a lot of those people as well. So
can they stay and become citizens, or what's
after 5 years, you know, if they've worked here for more than that time, they can apply for citizenship.
That's not very long, actually.
It's not long, no.
But
you know, like Ireland's population, although we do have, you know, the constraints of the housing market at the moment, you know, Ireland has a massive productive capacity. You know, it's the carrying capacity of Ireland, given its energy generation and its food production, etc. If you were to look at it, those kind of more old-fashioned criteria, you know, we could take more. Now, if you put a layer or a lens of environment over that, we would say, well, we are all going to have to work within tighter constraints, and we would need, you know, to preserve some of the woodland, preserve the wetland, preserve the farmland. But like density is probably the solution for much of what Dublin, for example, would want to achieve.
Okay, interesting. And so what do you think is the importance of research and like hard fundamental research for innovation going forward? And what I mean by that is, like, the past 10 years, you've had this huge digitization revolution, right? Which is like, you know, you don't really need to know much about biology or, you know, medicine or chemistry or these types of harder sciences to build a social network, right? You know, you just don't need to, right? And so much of the value that's been created in the stock market and out of the tech sector and for the venture capital community is based on these really fast, you know, high growth, you know, either SaaS softwares or network effect businesses and things like this. I think that's slowing down a bit, right? Like, I'm not going to say we're over with it. I think that I read something the other day that like the subscription economy is huge, but it's believed to only be in its infancy, right? So like this business model innovation, which doesn't require hard sciences backgrounds, is still growing, but we're seeing more and more focus going towards things like producing different types of energy in different ways. Obviously sustainability with materials, food innovation, right? Which really requires that it's real science, right? Like and that requires a long gestation period of investment to develop the technology before you can realize its commercialization. So do you think that therefore universities are going to become more important in that regard, or it's still going to be just VCs pumping money like into it and losing a bunch of it, maybe getting a couple of big winners?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very mixed bag. So, for example, Trinity, we have a Science Foundation Ireland, for example, which disperses large pots of money to the different educational institutions or academic research institutions, including Trinity. So we'd have nanotechnology, you know, centers. We'd also have human-machine interaction centers as well. Really interesting stuff. Advanced telecommunications, looking at, you know, 6G and looking at photonics, quantum photonics. And then if we look at something like quantum, for example, quantum is something very, you know, fundamental research. But it's actually, as we look to deliver something in Ireland, we're looking to the tech firms, because we don't have, for example, a quantum computer of our own. IBM, Microsoft, you know, they do. And so we would be buying time, expertise, sharing. We've got an MSc in quantum technologies. They send people on it. We ship out talent to them. So I think for some of those things, it's going to be a blend. I mean, it's hard because, you know, I don't want to speak to it too much because there's probably a college policy to it. And, you know, I'm much more the, you know, coming in directly at the coalface immediately. So for me to speak to something that a researcher might spend 25 years developing with no, you know, with no sense of where it might go in the end is quite difficult. It's hard for me to speak to that, but you know, we have seen it. So there's been like amazing spin-outs coming from Trinity, like Inflazome is one of them, where, you know, at the beginning it wasn't looking to spin out, but actually then got bought by a large pharma company. So with this stuff, you just never know. And you never know when you're going to, you know, knock an atom out of its place and all of a sudden you've got like vastly more efficient solar panels, you know.
Sure.
When we talk about the societal problems, I see it, and the reason I'm so excited about Trinity East and Portal is because I see it as being, what I really want to have in there is I want to have the green finance people, so the innovation in finance and how we manage that. But I also want to have the behavioral science people in there to work out, you know, we have many of the technologies that we need to make a big dent in the societal problems that we have. It's about the deployment of them, or building, you know, business models, in business model innovation, as you said. And then we need those fundamental research. So I really would like to have the quantum people in the same space as the policy people, as the climate change artists, as the green finance people, and put them all together and have this idea of like that it emerges from that, what the solutions are. And we're all very much in silos, I think, in our expert groups, and some of the great values across the span of science have been the accidents and the serendipity and the people from different domains working together and spotting things.
Sure. So what do you think is after you get this thing built or get it ground broken, kicked off, what do you think you're gonna do next?
It's very high. Like, of course, part of what I'm doing is trying to get an insight into what's next. And I think if you're to do a job like the job that I'm doing, and this is true for the people who run these places in UCD, which is another peer University of Ireland, or ETH, and you know, you have to be those people. It's not to say that you won't give your heart and soul to it as a proposition in and of itself, but you probably won't do it effectively unless you also have one eye to what might be in the future. It's very hard to go into the entrepreneurial world and not be smitten by it. You can be bruised by it, you can be, you know, but you kind of would tend to go back because that's where there's the freedom and the potential impact.
Yeah. Do you think there's a lot of available talent for things like coaching and mentorship also within the university infrastructure for people trying to start companies? Because this is one of the things I think that ETH has struggled with. They have a lot of technologies, but they've had difficulty to commercialize them because, you know, you can have something that makes a better mousetrap, but if no one buys it, or if it's not better enough, like making that value proposition as to whether or not it can become commercial is a different leap. And it's kind of a shame, right? Like so many technologies exist and are ubiquitous that are not the best solution for that problem, right? It's just that's the way the life works.
Well, I think it's the business execution, you know, and you run a business yourself with your bare hands and the sweat of your brow, and you know that it's all about the execution of it. You know, you don't have to have USP other than, you know, you deliver on time, on budget.
Unfortunately, it's not always the sexy thing that works out. It's the work that works out.
Right? So it's the execution. So like you said, you can have the better mousetrap, but it's, you know, it's not going to work out for you. Now, I think, as I'd mentioned before, the research development office, where you get a good base for people to be able to do the research, that they're well funded, so that they have brain space to do the research and then even think about how it might be applied,
right?
And that they are staffed well enough that somebody could start to explore the commercialization opportunities of this. And then we do have in the college this Trinity Research and Innovation sections that, you know, will handhold people. So, for example, we have somebody who would have come from the, you know, Enterprise Ireland side of things, who is now in-house and can give people the insights, or then hire people like me who have done it.
Right.
And I think there's a wonderful thing that I think for anybody who's thinking about going into the startup world or scale up, is that the people who have learned something or had made mistakes cannot wait to tell other people so that they don't make them, because that somehow brings purpose to having gone through that suffering.
Exactly. There's like some sort of validation of the fact.
Yes, there's some catharsis, you know.
No, I feel that way all the time. It's like, well, that was an error, and like I feel a lot smarter because of it, but it still would have been great not to make it.
And even you know, our interaction here is kind of, you know, it's kind of, there's some way of kind of getting what you know, or the opportunity of you as a resource to help out there, so that we can rise the tide a little bit for everybody. And
also, you know, for me, just like the creep of age is the killer, right? Because like you realize, like, wow, like as you accumulate experience, you're just so much more equipped to do this. But then once you've been through it, not only are you older, you're kind of like, well, do I really want to do that again? Right. It's because, I think there's also just a huge element of luck of any of these things.
Yeah,
Right?
timing.
So, yeah.
Timing. If you look at the team, the skills of the team, the market opportunity, it all comes down to timing.
Yeah.
So
Key customers that you just happen to meet or something like that, right? All that stuff,
Yeah. But I see it like playing in traffic. I mean, the more you do it, the more likely you are to get hit.
Exactly. That's
So
exactly right.
there's a time spent. So
Yeah.
I've kind of seen that you see people struggling for the first few months, maybe the first year, maybe the first year and a half.
Yeah.
But almost inevitably, by that point, they'll have either pivoted enough or been in the market long enough, or the market will have moved enough.
Yeah.
Then their proposition somehow kind of gets a bit of traction, and then away they go. So
yeah, I think everyone goes through that different mentally. For me, that's actually the most interesting part about being an entrepreneur, I think, is like how you manage that uncertainty. It's like any adventure. For me, I like data, right? I was saying the other day is like data can help you make better decisions. That's true, but the data is still imperfect, right? It's at the end of the day, you still are making like a decision, which is kind of
there's biases,
like
which
lots of different factors,
choose.
right?
Yeah.
But I think that what data helps you do is it helps you have conviction about a direction, right? Yeah. And I was listening to a podcast by the founder of Dyson once, and because he went through a lot of rejection before he got his vacuum cleaner resold. And he says, most of the time when you run a race, when you get to the 3/4 mark, most people give up, right? And that's like a critical part of the race. It's also true in rowing. It's like the 3rd quarter of the race is the most important, because everybody, once they see the finish line, sprints. Like every horse goes for the barn, right? But it's the 3rd quarter where people's willingness to continue pushing matters. And that's also where you have the most doubt. And what data can help you do is, if you convince yourself that you've made a good decision based on information, it can help you just sort of not worry about whether or not you're doing the right thing through the kind of like that 3rd quarter, and just like go the stretch. And then you're right, like then you kind of get over a hump and you start to see, things are kind of cracking a little bit. I can see the next thing on the other side. And this is not something that I think typically human beings like to do, right? Like they understand at the beginning that nothing is certain, but then you invest a certain level of time, and then you start to believe like, well, I should have something. But if you don't see anything, you don't see anything. And if you start to then second guess what you're doing and the path you're taking, then you change course and then you never find out. And we see this with companies making new products all the time, like innovative products. They always kind of like right at the threshold of when they're almost concluded on like information of what to do, they second guess themselves, right? Yeah. It's like, well, if you would just like go just one more step, you'd have like enough information where all of a sudden you'd feel comfortable in the decision you're making, and then you would have conviction, right?
And that's it. And the decision can also be no go, not go.
Oh, for sure.
So that's it. So there's a kind of there's a fetish for people just being resilient to the point of self-destruction.
Right.
It's kind of oxymoron.
Because you hear a lot of these hero stories about that, right? Because the people that get to the end of that, or over this hump through that 3rd quarter, they kind of say, oh yeah, well, I had a lot of courage, I had a lot of guts, like I never looked back. It's like, well, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Maybe you just had conviction because you had a piece of information that no one else had, and but you did what you did, right? And it wasn't like you're tougher than someone else. It's like you just did it.
You just don't hear from the other people because there's no platform for them.
Exactly.
Nobody wants to hear from the nearly made it. They want to hear from the unicorn story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that then you have all of these people that sort of blow up, and you have plenty of people that decide to shut down because they realize like, yeah, that's not going to work, right? And then,
well, for me, for example, with my project, I kind of thought, well, it's not going to be a rocket. I can see I was able to pay myself the wage that I would have had, my opportunity cost had gone down to 0, but was it going to be something that would scale? It still had to wait. And in fact, another company kept going with the technology, and they had to swap out of this LP-WAN and go into narrowband IoT. And then they had to swap out of narrowband IoT and go to 5G, and it still hasn't shipped. It's 5 years later. So you got and
it's also like how much fun you're having with it, right? Like I think
you have to know when to leave the party.
Yeah.
You're at your peak fun is sometimes you should leave.
I suppose. Yeah.
So it's a tricky one. And I think that's why you need people around as well who've been there before. You don't have to take the advice, but it's good to have the advice And I think these spaces are useful for that.
Yeah,
And
it's
also,
true.
I'd really like to have the space that we have as like a intergenerational space as well, because if you look at the statistics out of the US when they analyze entrepreneurs and who take on staff, it tends to be people who are over 40. So they've had a career, they built up that resilience. They wouldn't jump into an idea unless they thought it was going to work. So they might be that little bit more risk averse. Their chances of success are higher than the 20 to 30 cohort. And I think that's very interesting to look at. And I also think now we have a lot of like incredibly talented people who may even be so talented that they retire early. And then what do they?
Yeah, I think they're retiring early and then they say they want to stay involved in something, but they don't really. I have a lot of respect for people that do like 2 startups and they have a lot of success at both, not because success is the metric, but like I think that you have to have a lot of desire to do it a second time when you've already done it once and you have, in a way you could tell yourself you have nothing more to prove.
Yes.
I mean, the other thing I think that is great is older people, right? Like people that are even, retired or semi-retired.
Third age.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, I don't want to like work all the time because I'm trying to enjoy myself. I want to like look after my health. But, when you can engage them in a way that their expertise is really key, that's much better than hiring like a really expensive middle-aged person who happens to have that same kind of CV experience.
Yeah.
But they're also more willing in kind of like beating their chest and pushing their weight around, which is a challenge that I've faced. Like, trying to think about hiring like another senior person in the business, like a really senior business leader. It's
True alpha.
It's almost disruptive to think about. I mean, we're getting now to a size where I think it's going to be necessary, but yeah, I think that some people that are like, that are past their retirement age, they know so much, right? They have so much perspective, but they don't want to work all the time, right?
But actually, you said like in terms of they want to take care of their health, but this is taking care of their health.
Mentally, yes, right. But look, working 60 hours a week at the age of 62 is not helpful.
No, they're not going to answer after a while.
yeah, like yeah, you need to stay mentally active, but you don't want to be like pulling all night.
but some people have worked it out to the extent where they're not interested in presenteeism. They're not interested in doing 60 hours on the clock. They're interested in, somebody saying, this is the outcome that we need. If you can do it in 30, that's super, and they're interested in, doing interesting things. So they won't be there unless they feel that they can add the value, because what's the, possibly they're already financially.
Yeah, exactly. Like they have nothing to prove, basically.
Now, what I'm hoping, of course, is that all of these people who have, enormous talents are going to be working on purpose-driven, climate change and biodiversity issues, but we'll see. But I think there's a resource there that there's got to be a better way to capture in some way, because that's a lot of value to society.
Yeah, I think it's brought on by this obsession with retirement. Like the whole pension system basically creates this idea that you should be at leisure when you're older, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a cultural thing, right? So I don't intend to do that, right?
But then you're not 65 yet.
I'm not 65.
No, that's what happens. But I can't imagine it for myself either. And I do think that there's something to be done there around facilitating people who have skills. It's a bit like Fiverr, for like deeper, longer term skills.
Exactly. Right. And then you have some of these things, like every once in a while I'll get asked to like be a consultant to some deal or research that's being done, and they pay you an obscene amount of money per hour. That's also really not that interesting, because you just like, whatever, you're just having an interview. You think you want to get involved in something, you want to get to know the people, you want to learn a little bit about the team. Something to keep you vital mentally is important.
And it's also, I think the reason that I want to have, those third age people in the space as well is for, it's not necessarily to keep the third age people, occupied, or it's part of our social responsibility in that way. I think it's really important for people who are starting out even to learn from people who've been there before. And I think you're right, there's kind of a cultural approach or category that people get put into, that when you've retired, that's the end of your value somehow.
Right. Or it's not cool to work anymore, right?
Yeah. But I think that as we were talking about how some of these domains are pretty much endless, the opportunity is only limited by the number of people that you can get. So this idea of, well, if old people keep working, there's no space for young people to do the job. And I think in old bureaucracies, maybe that was the case. There's only so many jobs to go around. But if you're adding value on the internet, I don't see those constraints.
I don't either. I mean, I think that there's, yeah, I mean, previously these people got pushed out by companies that didn't want to carry their pension liabilities anymore. They wanted younger people, or they said, look, yeah, and it's like, okay, the law says that at 65 you can start collecting a pension, so go ahead and do it, right? But now those people have other employment or engagement opportunities outside the traditional company 9 to 5, which I think is fantastic, right? So I just think this whole distributed work, and
it's going to be different. The future is definitely going to be different than the present for multiple reasons. And I think even the way, something like Portal, for example, I think that's a great testing ground for those things. I think it's great for students to come out and try a kind of gig economy approach before they go into the milk round for a large corporate.
Which, by the way, I don't recommend. I don't recommend kids coming out of university and going directly into this gig economy, let me work from my kitchen type of a thing. I do think that there's a lot of value in being part of like going to work every day, right?
And I think that these spaces, whether it's Portal or it's the other peer ones that we have in Dublin or Zurich or wherever they are, I think, it's like a third space where people can go and have a look at it. So people who need talent can go and have a look at some of the talent working. But the opposite is also true, that the talent is looking at the culture, albeit a small insight, small bit of the culture of these different organizations. And it's about fit.
Yes.
People love corporate and some people love startup. And unfortunately, to understand whether the fit works or not, people have to go and take a real job in one of those. I myself, I like working in corporations, right? There's nothing about it I didn't like. I mean, it moves slower. But there's still similar challenges to deal with. You can still get excited about stuff. Yeah, I guess you don't worry about things on the weekend as much as when you're running a startup, right? I don't miss that actually. I like it. Like I like being like ever present with kind of like the challenge, right? And I think when you work with a big company, it's just really easy to kind of divorce yourself of it. Clock out. You clock in, you clock out. You develop other interests. But I suppose when you're in the startup, it is, and again, I think you're right. Of course, there are the people for whom they will burn out that way, and that's fine. And then it's not for them. But I think it is okay to understand that there are some people who, that is really very manageable for them, and they, in fact, like it.
Yeah, I think it's going to still take all kinds, right? It's just, I think there's just going to be, you have more workforce coming online. And I don't know if you have more work for these people. That's the other thing that's of concern, right? So like, how do you keep people fully employed and making productive, because they also need to make money, right? So there's a lot of interesting things.
Yeah, I suppose that's going to have to come from, national or even supranational levels, and say, well, where are the goalposts and what are the objectives of this society? Is there another layer after service economy?
Right.
In terms of the hierarchy or the level, I think those things are still unknown. But again, being in the startup world, it's amazing to see the industries being disrupted, or the thought pattern, and particularly working in the innovation space with the university. People are tasked, like I said, this human, so we have a Science Foundation Ireland Centre called ADAPT, and they're working on this project called Human Plus. And so they're working with the Accenture Dock, so the innovation hub for Accenture in Dublin. And you're looking at kind of avatars, and the way you dress your avatars. What's that saying about you, or what's that saying about the culture, or this kind of avant-garde of how we present ourselves in the metaverse. What influence that's going to have. Like you're almost starting at ground zero for new cultural society.
That's a bit beyond my interest level at my age.
There's so many things that we in our culture now say, God, that's terrible, and we should never have done it like that. And we have this whole contrition over how awful it was, how we treated people. And now we have a new world that we're creating in some senses. We have to come up with a new with what you would hope would be a better way of doing it. But that doesn't just happen.
Right.
You have to decide. It doesn't have to be rules based. They have to be kind of conventions, you know. What
Yeah,
does your
I
t-shirt say
think
on avatar? Is it okay that it says, you know?
those conventions will, I think will evolve, and like everything else. Yeah, we'll see. I think it's interesting times. Listen, we're at time. I've got to run, but great talking to you, and great to see that things are going well. And like look forward to seeing some renderings and groundbreakings on the internet when
Yes, well, you're always invited.
Okay.
You know
All right.
that.
Thank you very much.
Very
All right,
good.
take care, Mark. See you.
All right, Dan. Cheers.
Bye.